The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Just its name alone can conjure a feeling of pure joy and adventure. For many, not only is it their favourite Zelda game, it's their favourite game, full stop. But this opinion wasn't exclusive to fans of the genre. It was shared by critics, scoring dozens of perfect scores and winning several Game of the Year awards, not to mention selling more than 30 million copies by the end of 2022. But great sales does not make a great game. Just look at Tetris. How is this game even the slightest bit fun? Anyway, does Breath of the Wild deserve its many 10 out of 10 scores? Is it as close as a game can get to perfect? Do I dare criticize it? Will these questions ever end? Yes. Here's my thorough review for Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Released on March 3rd, 2017, Breath of the Wild burst onto the scene after a colossal wait of 6 years following the release of Skyward Sword. Many of you may be already aware of the Zelda effect. For those who aren't, this is where a new main series Zelda release makes fans more thankful for the previous main series Zelda title. But for Breath of the Wild, this didn't appear to happen. So vast was the craze of Breath of the Wild that many simply stated, Skyward what? This game would go back to its roots, right back to where it all began with the original 1986 Legend of Zelda, where players are dropped into the world with a task and not much else. Except this time around, thankfully, Link's adventure does not contain ridiculously hidden secrets like random bombable wars, or hard to navigate paths, or brutal dungeons. Breath of the Wild would do away with Zelda conventions of the post-Zelda 2 world, like immersive dungeons, but we'll explore that in detail later. Following its release, the main series Zelda had its first DLCs, the Master Trial and the Champion's Ballad. For me, this is a game I've played a lot. In fact, of 100% of the game on Master Mode, which I'll rant about later. However, I will endeavour to examine the features of the game with as little bias as possible, though it's near impossible to eliminate it altogether. For this review, I'll be examining the gameplay, music and sounds, as well as the world and lore. I'll be including both praise and criticism, so if you came just to hear someone slobber all over it, or to hear someone bag it out for an hour, you've come to the wrong place. Let's jump right in. A discussion of the gameplay alone could take several hours, so where do we even start? How about the very start, the opening area? The Great Plateau is close to, if not the best tutorial stage, not only of any Zelda game, but any modern video game. It balances teaching the player the mechanics of the game, providing lore, and giving player freedom and initiative to explore the world around them, whilst providing a challenging but not necessarily harsh environment to conquer. Within this area alone, you are provided with the means to take on the world. Now, this definitely has its positives in an open world genre game, but also has its negatives if you're looking for a classic Zelda experience, which we'll touch on later. Within the opening minute of the game, you're able to pick up weapons, mushrooms, lizards, bugs, fruit, climb trees, get some lore, be introduced to Korok seeds, identify the difference between one-handed and two-handed weaponry, understand how pushing boulders works, introducing you to an incredibly fun physics mechanic, and fall to your death off of a cliff. That's right, you can die within the first 30 seconds of the game quite easily. Probably not true in Zelda games since the very first Zelda, and I've played the very first Zelda game, it ain't exactly a breeze. It's such a beautifully crafted opening that doesn't hold your hand, making subsequent playthroughs infinitely more enjoyable than previous titles in this regard. You were hinted towards certain areas by a random old man, a Zelda staple, but you are by no means bound to do it. You may not be able to get to the rest of the world at this point, but you can explore the tutorial area of the game to your heart's content, providing a feeling of safety, but overall excitement, because even within the first minute, you haven't even got a good taste of what the rest of the Great Plateau has to offer. As I'll be touching on the world of Breath of the Wild in the corresponding section, I want to take this chance to discuss the mechanics of the game, starting with the physics engine. The physics of objects in the world and the incredible things you can do with it is close to an infinite source of fun. It starts small with rolling boulders onto enemies, to cutting a light that will blow up explosive barrels to destroy enemy bases, to climbing on half-fallen stasis trees that will fly you across the world like they do in speedruns. It's clear that a lot of time and a lot of care went into it. There are times when certain puzzles can randomly fling in weird directions, but they are so rare that you can write it off as a novelty and an otherwise very solid foundation. Not only is it made exceptionally well, the physics engine is utilized in the game's puzzles and fights, which have always been Zelda's two hallmarks of game making. Just look at what the two Oracle games were themed after. No, I'm not talking about the themes of Seasons and Ages, but if you've played them, you know one heavily focuses on puzzles in Oracle of Ages, while the other focuses on combat, Oracle of Seasons. Breath of the Wild having a mechanic that can be utilized in both circumstances is the cherry on the top of this wedding cake. Speaking of combat, Breath of the Wild boasts the most diverse battle system of any Zelda game. I don't mean this as a criticism for previous Zelda games, but Breath of the Wild blows all other Zelda games out of the water when it comes to ways in which you can defeat foes. You have 3 types of hand-to-hand combat, with spears being the best to keep dangerous foes at a distance, 2-handed to allow powerful spin attacks, and 1-handed for more opportunities to parry attacks. The monsters, while not having a diverse range of creatures, each have a unique style of combating the player, meaning that you will have to diversify your attacks based upon the opponent you're fighting. And if you're fighting multiple enemies at once, come prepared with bomb arrows, Obi-Wan's high ground, or some champion powers, because dealing with multiple enemies at once is not very intuitive in Breath of the Wild. It's a small criticism, since there are limited ways to deal with multiple enemies at once, but Breath of the Wild is clearly weighted towards one-on-one combat, opposed to the multiple ways other open-world games allow players to deal with multiple enemies at once, like followers, spells, summonings, traps, etc. Another small criticism that I'll bring attention to, that I don't see anyone else talking about, is a very slight delay between completing one action and starting the next. At first I thought this might be an issue with the Joy-Cons, as there are definitely issues with the Joy-Cons, but it happened to me far too consistently with different Joy-Cons to be anything but a Breath of the Wild issue. It's not something you will notice if you're a pro or you're very used to controlling Link and doing attacks in a formulaic way, but there is a split-second delay whenever Link recovers from a previous attack, or being attacked, or ragdolling, where he will not respond to your input. It's the only Zelda game where I've experienced Link just standing there for a split second, deciding not to jump even though I need him to jump as a massive Lionel bears down on him. It's not a big deal, mind you, but it's frustrating in an important battle. Now let's talk about climbing. Boy oh boy, where to start with this? Along with the physics engine, climbing is the most important gameplay mechanic in Breath of the Wild. The world is designed for you to climb it. If you can see it, you can climb it, except for the cliffs outside the land of Hyrule. Aside from the shrines and a few other materials, you can climb pretty much any surface, meaning if you have enough stamina, you can get up there. It's climbing alone that makes a decision between a heart or a stamina vessel so difficult. It's such a divergence from what previous Zelda games have allowed you to do. Take any of the 3D Zeldas and you'll always have something akin to vines, which give you the ability to climb a wall. Well, throw away those vines because the hero of the world doesn't need them. The climbing mechanic can be so rewarding to do when in game. To get to a location and just taking a second to admire how high up you are and looking over the world of Hyrule is such a rush. This is clearly what the developers had in mind when first formulating the climbing mechanic. Something that just screams absolute freedom. There are times when climbing at different areas can be rewarding, like Hylia's Bridge. There's various Korok seeds and treasure chests that can only be found by climbing around like a crazy person or a very active spider. And these, on the surface, feel great to accomplish. But this isn't a consistent feel when climbing. In fact, at times, climbing can be downright tedious and unrewarding. I'm not arguing that you have to be rewarded every time, but considering how vertical Breath of the Wild can be at times, I'd rather not have to spend so much time climbing, then resting, climbing, then eating stamina restoring foods, then climbing some more. Remember how I mentioned what an amazing tutorial Breath of the Wild has? Well, one of the reasons for that is there's always something to climb too. When you climb, there's always something within sight to reward you. But once you get out to the open world, the much, much larger open world, you can no longer be guaranteed that your reward is there. Yes, you can pretty much climb anything, but if there's little to be gained or you spent 10 minutes getting up there only to be rewarded with a view, then it starts becoming a bit pointless. This is very obvious when it comes to the snowy regions of the game. I'll talk more about these places in the world and lore section of the review, but regarding the climbing mechanic, you can spend over 15 minutes just climbing to the top peak, and your reward? A single Korok seed. No mysterious location, no unique NPC or interaction, no fast travel point, no additional lore, a single golden piece of shit. Now the snowy regions in the Great Plateau are great. Why? Well, for one, there's unique rewards there. On one peak in the Great Plateau, you can potentially get the warm doublet and a piece of amber, which is very nice at the start of the game. Another has a shrine. Another reason it's great, you can walk to the peaks. In other snowy regions, if you want to get to the top, you have to climb. And you can spend a good amount of time climbing for pretty much no reason at all. I'm well aware of the compliments Breath of the Wild gets from various admirers for being a game where you can climb anywhere, as opposed to other open world games. But maybe there's something to other games that are open world, but don't let you climb to the top of a mountain like you can in Breath of the Wild. Because there may not be a point. You can get amazing views in Skyrim without having to climb vertically up a side of a mountain. That's what horses are for. The only gain that comes from Breath of the Wild's climbing is a sense of accomplishment you get. But this is a self-created reward. The game doesn't reward it nearly enough for the time and effort poor Linky puts into climbing so much. Additionally, the game also alludes to the fact that climbing can be tedious by rewarding you with Rivali's Gale when defeating one of the Divine Beasts. It's practically admitting, yeah, climbing can suck, like a lot. Here's 3 upward drafts you can make. Sure, you can climb practically anything, but you have to make your own rewards for most of the time. Additionally, we have stamina. It's a great idea to limit the ability for Link at the start of the game to climb an entire mountain in one go. I completely agree with that sentiment. However, the stamina meter pales in comparison with how large the world is, both horizontally and vertically. The stamina meter in Skyward Sword made sense, since it fit well with the smaller scale of things, and how you could claim stamina fruit when sprinting in certain locations or climbing certain vines. It was implemented well there. In Breath of the Wild, you run out of stamina very quickly. Whether running or climbing or swimming, the stamina meter does not match the breadth of the game. It's underwhelming to say the least. The tiny bit of extra stamina you get for 4 orbs is laughable. Another area of criticism for climbing, and you knew it was coming, rain. Climbing in rain has been discussed to death by many others before me, so I'll leave it brief. It's poorly implemented. Fully upgraded climbing gear should negate it. It would give that gear a reason for existing, and the penalties for slipping shouldn't be both losing your position and losing stamina. Feels like this part wasn't tested enough, or they wanted players to be frustrated by one of the most important mechanics in the game, which boggles the mind. I think I've covered everything about climbing, so let's move on to shrines. Shrines are where the vast majority of puzzles take place. Some are short puzzles, very few are long puzzles, some are tests of strength, and some have their puzzles outside the shrine, or a few more have puzzles on the outside and the inside. There's no shortage of Reddit users who have calculated the amount of shrines that fit into each category, with tests of strength equaling 20, blessing shrines equaling 29, and puzzle shrines equaling 71. Does there need to be so many combat shrines? No. Does there need to be so many blessing shrines? No. And before you rush to the comments and say, but you said the puzzles were on the outside, I never said there are particularly good puzzles on the outside. In fact, there's a few that are just bomb this wall, well done, blessing for you. In fact, there doesn't need to be 120 shrines full stop. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this game could make do with cutting out 20 to 40 shrines out of the game altogether. Better yet, many of these shrines should be merged together, especially the ones that play with the same concept. There is one shrine that has you gliding over 2 ledges with an air current, and that's it. If this shrine was combined with another air current shrine, it would feel like you've actually earned a reward. Don't get me wrong, I completely get what they were going with when it comes to shrines. They fit in well with the lore of the world they are trying to create, and the story they're trying to tell. And the shrines have Zelda-like puzzles in them with a check for collecting, or treasure chests in each shrine if you want to push yourself with an extra challenge in them. Though, without hunting for these, the shrines are very often one-dimensional. When we look at the shrines as a gameplay concept, cracks start to appear. On your second or third playthrough, the shrines become one of the worst parts of the game. Unlike previous Zelda games, the self-contained puzzles don't interact with a larger theme or a larger dungeon, so they lose any novelty. Think of the 4 Poes in the Forest Temple in Ocarina, or Ancient Cistern in Skyward Sword. When you complete progress in these dungeons, it affects the rest of the dungeon in some way, or you see your progression play out. However, with Breath of the Wild's shrines, you're not gaining progress towards a final boss, or a better item, or seeing the dungeon evolve with new passages like you would in other Zelda games. You just complete the puzzle and you're done. You get your orb and you leave. That's it. Now, on a positive note, as many fans of Breath of the Wild have pointed out, there are various ways to complete these shrines, aside from blessings or combat shrines, which you really only have one way, if you're not trying to glitch a wall. And yes, it's important to acknowledge that these shrines have various ways for the player to solve them, which is great. though it's also important to acknowledge that players will still use the quickest method to solve them because that's common sense. When I was a kid playing Ocarina for the first time, and I was facing down Ganon in the final encounter, and he hits your Master Sword away, and I didn't have that, I didn't have the big Goron sword, I didn't have any magic power left to use light arrows. You want to know how I got through that stage of the battle? I spent close to an hour hitting Ganon's tail with the long shot. Yep, close to an hour. Now, was that a different way to beat that battle? Yes. Would I ever do that again? No. Why would I solve a puzzle in a different way to what is the quickest? Acknowledging that there are various ways to solve the puzzles in Breath of the Wild is also acknowledging that the puzzles aren't particularly deep. There's little in the way of aha moments, unlike previous Zelda titles. And the player wants to complete the shrines in the quickest time, because for every second they're in a shrine, it's time taken away from exploring. Now, you do the shrines because you have to get more hearts or stamina, but it's a drag to be taken away from the best parts of the game to complete a rather lackluster puzzle with an equally lackluster reward. Speaking of lackluster rewards, let's discuss Korok Seeds. Korok puzzles can range in difficulty from move this block here, to shoot these 5 fast-moving and far-away targets, wasting 20 arrows or more to get it done. For the same reward. One tiny golden piece of shit. All in all, there are 11 types of Korok Seed puzzles. Some of these are very easy, like the food offering, while others provide some level of difficulty, like races around a small area. To max out your inventory, you would need to collect 441 out of the 900 Korok Seeds in the world. Now, some may argue that the reason there are 900 is not to collect them all, but to allow you to reach the 441 threshold in a manner easier than collecting 900. As someone who has collected all 900, there's no need for that many. It's clear that the Korok Seeds are used as a means to litter the world with something, to cover up the dead space that exists in a world that's far too large. With a tiny fraction of that 900, you can have a perfectly reasonable amount of inventory space. Say 12 for weapons, 8 for shields, 8 for bows. Want to know how many Korok Seeds that takes? 27. 27 Korok Seeds for a reasonable amount of inventory space. Breath of the Wild has 900 for no good reason. There's definitely a reason they chose to put 900 in there, it's just not a good one. Now, some may argue that they provide something interesting to come across during your journey, that instead of a sword sticking out of the ground, they offer some mystery and puzzle to solve that creates a fun sidetrack towards the goal you're heading towards. The problem with this argument is that the feeling of excitement upon finding these wears off after your first playthrough. Knowing on each subsequent playthrough that I only need 27 or so Korok Seeds for an adequate inventory, I will skip most of the Korok Seed puzzles that I come across. Because why would I attempt them? The ones where you waste arrows shooting movie targets? No thanks. The ones where you chase flowers up the side of a cliff? No thanks. More lore or unique NPC interactions would have been far better for an open world game. Moving on to treasures, Breath of the Wild comes with a vast amount of different things to collect. Monster parts, gems, food items, potions, meals to cook, clothes to wear, plants, animals, bugs, ancient parts, dragon parts. There's a lot in the world of Hyrule. Early on, it's quite enjoyable to collect monster parts as you destroy them, smash deposits to collect valuable stones, make a campfire at the top of Ryola Spring to spawn Farosh, and shoot his horn with a few golden bows to collect 180 horns to be sold off for heaps of money, or incredibly powerful food and potion buffs. Good times. And who doesn't love to accessorize with a Link? My personal favourite is the Blood Red Barbarian armor set. Fortunately for those craving for the Zelda formula, clothes ever so slightly act as the items that are collected and enhanced along the way. Now, they're not an adequate replacement for the feeling you get in previous Zelda games when you finally track down the hookshot or upgrade your sword to the most powerful version, but it's something that brings variety to playthroughs and offers different abilities for different situations. The only drawback with this system is that some of the clothing require quite rare or hard to get materials, and the player just ends up going with an armor set of choice, like the Barbarian set, and using food or potions to substitute for the need to be cool or warm. And considering ingredients for these types of foods are far easier to come by than the materials required to upgrade clothing in most cases, the game unknowingly pushes players to this end. The only reason a player would upgrade multiple sets of clothing is mainly because of role-playing reasons, or they're crazy like me and want to do 100% playthrough on Master Mode that includes all clothing upgrades. Now, that's not to say there's no satisfaction from upgrading clothing. It definitely is. The Great Fairies serve this purpose by upgrading your clothing up to 4 times, one for each fairy you unlock. The progression to get these great fairies works well. It's very cheap to get the first, the second can be paid for by a side quest, and the third isn't far off that. The fourth will take some grinding or mass selling of items to get, but it's about what I would expect unlocking the final great fairy to cost. To upgrade the clothing, you need to have the correct ingredients. I do appreciate how each set of clothing has themed ingredients to upgrade a particular set. Like upgrading the Barbarian set takes Lionel parts, or upgrading the Sheikah set requires stealth items. The main drawback to the system is the rarity of some items needed for early upgrades. Items such as the Elemental Lizalfos tails or Elemental Keese wings can be a massive pain to get, and you could be stuck on just one upgrade for a set of clothing because of this. Next, let's examine the weapon durability system. The vast majority of weapons, bows and shields in this game have limited use, some more limited than others. It encourages the player to continually seek out weapons so they are not caught in a situation where they then must rely on the environment or bombs, which can be outside the player's control for the most part. It is the take of this review that the weapon durability system in itself is not bad, it's a design choice. But it's a design choice that comes with a high risk of imbalance. What do I mean? Well, have you ever found yourself going through a typical playthrough and just dropping weapon after weapon after weapon because you already have 12, 14 or even 20 in your inventory? Then other times you go through most if not all of these weapons in one fight with a Lionel or a group of strong enemies. Well, that's the risk of choosing a weapon durability system. When you don't need more weapons, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a dozen more. But when you need weapons the most, they vanish.
But when the world needed him most, he vanished.
I mean, they're nowhere to be found and you're in the middle of a battle with a Lionel and you can now only resort to bombs. Running out of weapons in a difficult situation can end up ruining the path you're on, much like climbing in the rain, as you'll have to stop what you're doing, go elsewhere, and hopefully find some weapons you can use so you can come back later. This mechanic has its ups and downs. Now you could theoretically max out your inventory space with weapons so you don't run out, but it's way faster to collect weapons over and over again than it is to collect hundreds of Korok seeds. Personally, I'm neither for and against this system. It can provide players with a variety of strategies they can implement. The addition of elemental weapons can make things easier as you light your enemies on fire, or freeze them in place. And boomerangs are pretty fun to use, and you can feel like a pro when you successfully catch it. This enjoyment wouldn't exist if you used the same weapon over and over again. But perhaps the most enjoyable part of the game, to a lot of players, is exploring the world at your own pace. I will discuss the world itself in the world and lore section, but the freedom the game lends the player is immense, and allows them to get lost in a very large world. As you walk through the world, there are often things to come across that ask the question of the player, what is this? While this is great in theory, the answer is quite often fairly mundane, usually a Korok seed or a shrine. Despite this, the game allows you to answer these mysteries on your own. No hand-holding, very few hints unless you seek them out, but rather unadulterated freedom. If I feel up to it, I can walk my way from one part of the map to the other, creating personal stories for myself, since the game isn't great at that, and conducting raids on monster camps. Also, is Link the bad guy?
Are we the baddies?
There's so many monster camps around where the monsters are minding their own business, chasing a boar or two, getting scared by bees, and here comes mean old Link, firing bomb arrows to completely wipe out their existence and everything they hold dear. Just a thought. Back to exploring, you hear all the time that what people love about this game is that it is so large and open. That alone doesn't make the game great. The real world is large and open, but it's terrible. That's why we play video games in the first place. Fortunately, there's multiple ways you can interact with the world. One simple example is the stealth mechanic. The developers were clearly going for a rather bare-bones, simplistic take on the stealth mechanic, so it's not an area this review will criticise, since it's not trying to be something that it's not. It's a fun, basic mechanic to sneak up on monsters and creatures of the world, and it works as intended. And just briefly, the shrine detector noise is terrible. Why the developers thought making it sound like an alarm you'd wake up to in the morning before going off to work or school was a good idea is beyond me. What's wrong with making it sound pleasant? There's surely a mod out there for that. Finally, I wish to touch on another thing open world games are known for: choices. In the vast array of open world games, there is an option to play in various different styles, where different choices lead to differing paths and skills. One thing common in the vast majority of this genre is player-led play styles. Basically, you can choose a sneaky character, or a magic character, or a brutish might character, with endless mixing and possibilities in between. What are the playstyles in Breath of the Wild? It's a game that has tropes of the open world genre, but some of the most interesting ones, like playstyles, are either bare bones or completely missing. In many other open world games, you'll increase in experience to level up or improve skills the more you use them. Link, however, his strength is determined by the weapons and armor he has, and that's it. Breath of the Wild navigates straight past this with an in-game world explanation that Link is already a fully trained knight, but has amnesia. In fact, there are flashbacks where he has sustained injuries from these fights. So clearly someone in the development team realized this missing piece of a typical open world game and added an explanation, so I'll give them credit for that. But the absence of gameplay choices in each consecutive playthrough is disappointing to say the least. The only changes you can make to your journey is what clothing he'll wear. It's a far cry from other popular open world games in which you'll play an array of different styles. The world does level up with its 4 to 5 levels of monsters, but it's still very possible to come across pathetically weak weapons when you've completed the Divine Beasts. More importantly though, this is Breath of the Wild's biggest issue. Is it trying to be an open world game or a Zelda game? Isn't it just convenient to say, oh, but it's a Zelda game, when it falls short in its open world genre? Or say, oh, but it's Zelda's first open world game, when it falls short in the beloved Zelda formula? You can't change genre when it suits you. Breath of the Wild has endeavoured to be both, and should be criticised when it falls short in both. Now on to music, sounds, and voice acting.
Hero of Hyrule, chosen by the sword that seals the darkness.
Zelda music has some of the most beloved gaming tunes of all time. With consistency, Zelda titles have whisked players away on a fantastical journey with an atmospheric soundtrack and immersive tracks. There is no shortage of iconic songs in the Zelda series, from the Song of Storms to the Dark World. In the game themselves, Link is given the ability to play music that possesses a wide range of uses. So music is clearly very, very important to the Zelda series. In Breath of the Wild, however, the place of music is hotly debated among lovers and critics alike. I will also be mentioning the English voice acting in this section, as I speak English and that's what I listen to. I understand that the Japanese voice acting is far better, but for this part I'll be comparing it to another Japanese RPG with English localization, but that will be a little bit later on. Let's start with the soundtrack. Breath of the Wild's soundtrack boasts over 200 tracks, from pieces such as the pleasant main theme to short pieces such as The Strange Old Man, which lasts a total of 12 seconds. What can be quite jarring for old school Zelda fans is the change of style in Breath of the Wild's music composition compared to previous titles. While these titles have had more romanticised or classical form, Breath of the Wild went with a more postmodern or impressionist style. Now, a change of style is not bad or good on its own. The question is, does it fit into the game world? Does it get the reaction from its audience that it needs to? One perspective that is constantly brought up when discussing Breath of the Wild's overworld music is that the music suits the open world. That if it was a tune like previous Zelda games, then it would get repetitive and annoying, briefly moving past the counter-argument that the overworld music Breath of the Wild chose to include is annoying and repetitive anyway. To that I say, please name one Zelda overworld tune that people find annoying. I'll wait. I've seen this argument many times, and in no instance has the person making this argument ever given an example. Ergo, the argument is false. Now you could argue that none of the previous Zelda titles were as big as Breath of the Wild, which is correct. But then there's an easy solution. You either have multiple overworld tracks, or the track changes depending upon the location, which already happens in Breath of the Wild with its minimalist music. Additionally, players naturally tune out the overworld music if they're playing long sessions of the Wind Waker, for example. It never gets annoying. The player chooses when it's appreciated, like when you first set off on your journey. But this leads to another point. Breath of the Wild has different overworld tracks for different locations and for night and day. However, the question that this review asks is whether these tunes, that may refer to as short piano jingles, are necessary at all. What exactly do they add that their absence could not? During the filming of The Dark Knight Rises, in particular the first fight scene between Batman and Bane, Christopher Nolan argued that the reason he has no music is that the blows, the grunts, the clash itself becomes the music of the scene. It draws the audience's attention, not to a mood that the music number would try to create, but to its raw meaning, how utterly hopeless this fight will end up as the hero is defeated. Why do I bring this up? Because it can be applied to Breath of the Wild's overworld music. Some of the time in your open world exploration, no music or jingle plays at all, which then logically leads to one conclusion. That is a testament to how pointless the piano jingle is. If you want the feeling of an open world, then why not let the sounds of the wild be the backdrop? Why add these random sounding piano keys into the mix? What do they add? Again, The answer is nothing. They add nothing. Like the far open empty spaces, it's a pointless addition. It's clear that developers have made a choice to have an open world soundtrack that allows the world to breathe, to hear the wilds at their rawest, which is fine. But I've not found a single compelling argument to justify the inclusion of the soft piano overworld track. Additionally, it's hard to accept the argument that some pieces of music are deliberately in tune with the mood you are supposed to be feeling at a certain location. But when the music is representing an open space and not evoking any mood, then it's okay as well. You can enjoy it like that, but it's hard to argue when the soundtrack and musical themes are criticised for being inconsistent. Zelda music has almost exclusively aimed to invoke an emotional reaction from the audience no matter the location, but overworld music and the shrine music, which you hear a lot, simply does not do this. Now I'm not suggesting that it has to. What I'm pointing out is that other Zelda games have in the past, but even Breath of the Wild dabbles in that practice, and that's shown no better than Hyrule Castle itself. For lovers of the Zelda formula, this has exactly what you're looking for. Music that evokes emotions of danger or the coming storm. The castle has many passageways, monsters to fight, some puzzles that are themed throughout the location, and ends with a final boss. But it's the music of Hyrule Castle that really sets it apart from the shrines or the divine beasts. Most tracks in Breath of the Wild are taken from previous Zelda titles. This is not a new practice, but it's what the game does with these tunes that sets it apart from its predecessors. Take the Temple of Time theme. It deliberately removes most of the track and replaces it with, you guessed it, nothing. It's an artistic choice that is represented in several other tracks in the game. Now it's up to the player to interpret what these absences could mean for them, but a general consensus is that it represents a fallen world, an apocalyptic world that's missing so many of its original pieces, and it's up to Link to try and put them back together. Though I do accept that these mid-song absences of sound are very common in longer tracks of Breath of the Wild. On top of that, the use of previous Zelda songs, while edited to the point where you may not even recognise it, is far-reaching throughout the soundtrack, leading to a heavy reliance on previous soundtracks. While Breath of the Wild is unique among Zelda titles, the justification for its soundtrack is not. Breath of the Wild is not the only Zelda game that deals with great loss, an apocalyptic setting, or the presence of evil. So despite the change to an open-world game, musical tracks in Breath of the Wild that try to denote these themes can be compared with previous Zelda soundtracks that attempt to do the same. Let's examine some tracks that deal in sadness or loss. What about destruction and ruin? Finally, the presence of evil. It's hard to avoid judging these tunes without bias or opinions, so I'll leave it up for you to decide which tunes best denote the atmosphere they're trying to create. There are some great tunes in this game, such as Hateno Village, Gerudo Town, Hyrule Castle, Korok Forest, to name a few. On top of that, the music does not cut in and out depending on your location like previous Zelda titles. As there are no loading screens between locations in this game, the tunes will be heard faintly when they're way off, but get more pronounced as you move closer, like the Stables theme or Cass's theme. There's also audio cues when you are closer to certain locations, which naturally weaves its way into the background without the player noticing. Another positive for Breath of the Wild's soundtrack is the encounter theme when facing off against the world's mini-bosses. Again, they work seamlessly into the background of the action, but provide players with the information about their suddenly more dangerous situation. In fact, all monsters will attract a change in music, but the lesser monsters will only provide a small indent into the overall sounds of the world compared to the mini-bosses. But for most of us, we didn't even notice, which works really well for what Breath of the Wild is trying to do. And I couldn't talk about monster music without mentioning this panic-inducing track. It does not fail to get me on edge every time, even when I'm completely prepared to take it on. It's far worse hearing it when you're not prepared at all. This track is perfect for what it's trying to portray in this instance. Now let's talk about voice. This brings us to another sale point for Breath of the Wild. It's English localization, specifically the voice acting. Now personally, voice acting means very little to me, but upon review, the voice acting is mediocre. Consistently mediocre. Now what do I have to compare this to? Glad you asked. The answer is Dragon Quest XI. I want to quickly go through the differences between these two games' localization, demonstrating what really good localization looks like and how Breath of the Wild falls well short. Let's start with the voice acting. Here's some examples from Dragon Quest XI.
You were starting to worry? And what about your poor little daughter all on her own, How do you think she's been feeling?
Then give me the pledge.
A knight's word is his bond, his kingdom his master. He serves the weak untiringly, challenges the strong unflinchingly, and never retreats in the face of adversity.
He once believed in the power of the luminary more than any of us. But he became convinced that you were evil, that you were the Darkspawn. He's not a man I knew any longer. Folks say he blames you for everything, even the death of his daughter. How could you, old friend? Come on, you horrible lot. This adventure isn't over yet. Onward to Yggdrasil! Crivens! how did that get there?
Wakey, wakey, little soldier. Come on now, time to get up.
I said wake up!
Now here's some examples from Breath of the Wild.
Open your eyes. Open your eyes. Then, we'll need some adjustments on that divine beast so Daru can manage it as easily as possible. He's figured out how to get it to move. However, it's apparent that we still have much more to learn.
I was thinking. This reminds me of the time we first met. You were just a reckless child. Always getting yourself hurt at every turn. Every time, I would heal you, just as I'm doing right now.
I was assessing the results of the experiment with the Guardians. These pieces of ancient technology could be quite useful against them.
I know that. They are essential to Hyrule's future, and our research demands that we keep a close eye on them. However, as the princess, you currently have a crucial unfulfilled responsibility to your kingdom.
They're not even in the same league. In fact, Dragon Quest XI has locations with people speaking in various accents, and it actually sounds good, except for the Australian accent, which just sounds bloody awful. On top of that, the written dialogue of Dragon Quest XI far exceeds that of Breath of the Wild. In the location of Hotto, every single NPC, both given a voice or just dialogue, speaks in haiku. All of them.
Two travelers come. Their timing is auspicious as the day's new dawn. My bathhouse awaits. Savor its steamy embrace as frogs do spring rain.
Ooh, that's no way to treat a lady. Didn't your mother teach you any manners?
Your words grate my ears. A good child should be silent and stay out of bars.
It's even more incredible when you realise that in the original Japanese, they don't speak in that manner. Only the English localization does. Then there's the mermaids of Nordica, who all speak in rhyme. All the time. See what I did there?
That voice, it's music to my ears. I feel like I could cry. Oh, darling, tell me, is it you? My one and only Kai? Thanks for finding Kai for me. You've been a proper friend. To trace my love across the sea until the bitter end.
For years now I have sought a way to remedy this curse. Alas, my every effort ends in failure or worse.
Breath of the Wild's localization is absolutely mediocre in comparison. Overall, critically, it's a mixed bag for Breath of the Wild in this category. Let's see if we can't turn this around. At last we come to the world and lore of Breath of the Wild. The sheer scale of this game warrants a video on this topic alone, which many have done before me. But I will endeavour to discuss each aspect of the world and lore in as much detail as a review-length video warrants. Let's start with the world itself. It is beautifully crafted with no shortage of amazing spots where you can just sit and admire your surroundings. It feels like a world that is lived in and alive with all the signs of life. As I mentioned earlier, the Great Plateau is one of, if not, the best starting areas or tutorials of any video game. It manages to provide players with a diverse range of features that they will come across when travelling the expansive world of Breath of the Wild, along with the necessary equipment needed to traverse the world of Hyrule. From the tops of the snowy mountain, where the shrine can be found, to the ruins guarded by, well, guardians. Various creatures abound, including a stone talus to really test early gamers, and a Lionel if you're playing Master Mode. I cannot compliment the Great Plateau enough for being pretty much the perfect opening to the game. However, there's a massive problem with the Great Plateau's perfection. The rest of the game simply cannot live up to it. With the Great Plateau, the game doesn't rely on Korak seeds or shrines to fill the empty space, as there really is no empty space. Every time you reach a location or defeat a monster, there's another 3 paths forward from that place, and then 3 more when you go elsewhere. The Great Plateau is jam-packed with things to do, but it never feels like it's cramped or overwhelming. It's the Goldilocks of areas. It feels amazing to explore the Great Plateau. Unfortunately, when you finish with and leave the Great Plateau, you never get that feeling back. Each area is as if someone took the Great Plateau, stretched it out 12 times its size, but put the same amount of points of interest in it. Instead of taking less than a minute to go to the next location, it takes another 10 minutes in other areas. Many appreciators of Breath of the Wild point to Hyrule's sheer size as a massive plus for the game, but it's one of its greatest weak points. We all know what purpose the Great Plateau serves, but what purpose does the Hebrew region serve? What about Gerudo Highlands? Lake Hylia? The world of Breath of the Wild is at least 2 regions too large. It simply does not possess enough points of interest to be this big. In previous Zelda games, new regions would come with new equipment to gain or upgrade. Zelda games thrive on it, but Breath of the Wild dies on it. You already have everything you need once you leave the Great Plateau and enter the rest of Hyrule. Even worse, not only is it too large horizontally, in some areas it's too large vertically. You can spend over 15 minutes just climbing one peak in the Hebrew region alone. While it makes sense lore-wise for the Divine Beast to exist in regions where its owner's race lives, there still leaves a lot of areas whose only purpose is to dump shrines and Korok seeds. Far too often, the reward for exploring is shrines and Korok seeds. There's very little else. The lore building of this world is extremely minimal. I've completed a fair few playthroughs, including 100% in Master Mode, and the only non-shrine or non-Korok seed rewards for exploring the world were the 7, 8 heroines or Satori Mountain. Nothing else stands out to me. Compare that to other open world games like Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, or Skyrim, which boasts dozens of neat locations that add to a rich world, or unique NPC interactions that leave a lasting effect on the player. That's lore. That's world building. Instead, Breath of the Wild boasts relics of a highly scientific but dead society that spent too much time building over 100 tests for one specific future dude, and not enough time working on medical technologies leading to a Shrine of Resurrection that takes 100 years to heal one person. What is the deal with that? The Sheikah need to get their priorities straight. In the last memory you can unlock in the main game, Link collapses protecting Zelda, so they take him to the Shrine of Resurrection. First of all, it's established in other flashbacks that the shrines don't react when a Sheikah slate is used on them, so why would the Shrine of Resurrection activate? Secondly, why the hell does it take 100 years? Are you serious? To quote pitch meetings, because the movie has to happen. But this is the lore that the developers created. A race that can create immense structures, various tests and mechanisms, great powerful beasts, yet when someone collapses, the best they've got is a room that takes 100 years to heal one person. Considering this person is a Link, he could have just slept it off in one night without any help at all. Instead, the Sheikah pulled a Roru, Sage of Light from Ocarina of Time, and put him to sleep for 100 years. The difference is, it makes sense in Ocarina of Time for the hero to be put to sleep, because he's just a little fella at the start of the game. Either the Sheikah are terrible with medical technologies, or they put Link to sleep for 100 years, neither of which makes sense. Why did it have to be 100 years? Seriously, for what lore reason did they choose 100 years? They've obviously chosen 100 years because it sounds good. It's a nice round number, but there's no real reason it couldn't have been 35 or 69 years. Nice. Poor Zelda is stuck with Ganon for 100 years because the Sheikah are pathetically moronic when it comes to medicine. Makes you glad they're no longer around. Maybe it makes you more sympathetic to the Yiga, if not for one major issue. Let me rant about the Yiga interactions for a second. They are clearly this game's attempt at unique interactions. The problem? The fights you have with the Yiga clan members are annoying and too numerous. They fight in a unique manner, but it's a uniquely annoying manner. Just serves to take time away from the fun of exploration. What's the result of coming across an NPC who turns out to be a Yiga agent? Well, when you see a random NPC on the side of the road, from then on, it could very well be a unique interaction, but it's more than likely a Yiga clan member who you don't feel like fighting, so you avoid it. Ergo, the game actively encourages you to avoid random NPC encounters by punishing you for seeking them out. That's downright poor game design for an open world genre game, and it's downright insulting for a Zelda game to do, a series where unique NPC interactions is one of its best features. And that's the thing about Breath of the Wild. It's trying to be both an open world game and a Zelda game. It definitely has features of both, but they're pulling each other in different directions. Speaking of Zelda staples, let's discuss the side quests of Breath of the Wild. As has been covered by many people, they are not top shelf side quests. They are mostly fetch quests with a few interesting ones sprinkled in between. Some of the side quests are referred to as shrine quests, which can be rather simple like bomb a wall or shoot an arrow. It definitely has the most side quests of any Zelda game, but as it is with the world, there should be less side quests and of higher quality. Speaking of less is more, many have made criticisms of the lack of diverse monsters in Breath of the Wild. From this review's perspective, this isn't a big issue. Each monster fights in a unique way, there are upgraded versions of each monster as there are with many other open world games or RPG games, and the world contains a few variety of mini-bosses in the overworld. The problem here is the diversity of the monsters does not match the expanse of the world they're in. But it would be better for the world to be smaller for various reasons, as I have touched on, rather than making the monster variety wider, in my opinion. However, to be fair to those who are critical of the monster variety in Breath of the Wild, it does have only 22 unique enemies, compared to 45 in Skyward Sword and 51 in Ocarina, to name 2. Now, I've been a bit critical of Breath of the Wild so far in this section, so let's change it up with a positive before I get stuck into it again. The mini-bosses I just mentioned are far more interesting to come across than the shrines or Korax. Each of the mini-bosses fight in an interesting way, and the feeling you get from taking down a strong Lionel is unmatched by many other things in Breath of the Wild. The various attack patterns of the Lionel, the way the Hinox will pick up a tree to throw it at you or block its eye when you're attacking it, all contribute to an enjoyable combat experience. But that's not all. The dragons are incredible. I remember back to my first playthrough. I was still moseying around the Great Plateau when out in the distance I saw a strange green object. I had no idea what it was, but I was absolutely breathless of the wild. Its inclusion at that early point of the game, and the ability to see it at such a far distance and not knowing what it was, but to be mesmerized, is one memory of this game that has really stuck with me. That's how you build a world. That's how you introduce lore. Rather than a silly NPC on the side of the road jumping out at you for the 50th time, there should be more of these experiences. The sheer scale of the dragons is just amazing. Even to this day, when I see the dragons coming my way, I get a massive rush. For me, it shows the potential of the world building this game could have had. Fortunately, there are a few locations that provide a rush to the player. The Lost Woods is one. The Typhlo Ruins, where everything is pitch black, is another. There's scatterings of these places, but it's not enough in between to keep the magic alive. Now let's discuss the storyline. The game starts with Link being woken by the voice of Zelda after 100 years of slumber. He's suffering from amnesia, and like us, must figure out what is going on. Having a player suffer from amnesia from the start of the game, like the game of the same name, allows the player to insert themselves into the character more fully. In the previous Zelda title, you could control a character who already had years of living in Skyloft, making friends and has association with anyone who makes up the small world of Skyloft. But in Breath of the Wild, Link has as much knowledge of the world as you do, and you both discover it together. As it turns out, Link was seriously injured and placed in Carbonite for 100 years, while Zelda is chilling in Hyrule Castle, encased within a cocoon with Ganon. She must be starving. As you explore the world, you eventually come across Impa. Or you don't, since you can do whatever you want. She explains the story that Ganon was first sealed away 10,000 years ago by a princess with the blood of the goddess and her chosen knight, along with 4 champions. Now here's where the first hiccup of the story occurs. Anyone who knows a bit about history understands human civilization has lasted for about 6,000 years. But in the lore of this game, the same royal family has ruled the kingdom of Hyrule for at least 10,000 years, not to mention how long these civilizations around them have lasted. Again, why have these arbitrary year choices? Why choose something far too unbelievable? Make it 1,000 at most. I guess they hurt themselves by choosing to put Link asleep for 100 years, so they times it by 100. I guess you can write it off as legend, but it takes away from your immersion in the story. You also learn that Ganon has laid waste to Hyrule Castle, or the Kingdom of Hyrule, though most other places in the world don't appear to be in much peril at all. In fact, most places are thriving. In Ocarina, it takes Ganondorf 7 years to destroy Hyrule Castle Town, warp the castle in his liking, freeze over Zora's domain, fill the Lost Woods with monsters, feed the Gorons to the dragons, and other such exploits. In Breath of the Wild, outside of Castle Town, there's really not much damage. Yes, the Divine Beasts are running amok, but they're more like nuisances to the people of those regions rather than active threats. Now the explanation could be that Zelda has kept Ganon at bay, and I'm happy with that explanation personally, but it's not really motivating me to help anyone. Anyway, you learn that, as Link, you must free the divine beasts that have been taken over by the deceptive and cunning, but at the same time chaotic and mindless, Ganon. So you travel to each race's area, fulfill some quests, board the divine beasts, and free the spirits of the champion. Each area you go to serves to remind Link of who each of the champions are, and paints a picture of a mostly friendly relation with each of the champions. Now, this would usually work in building some affection for or connection to the characters in the story. But the problem is, you can't feel a connection to these characters. You can't really care for them since they're already dead and have been for 100 years. In the previous Zelda entry, despite the long introduction, you were positioned to care a lot for Zelda, or at least understand that Link cares greatly, so you were motivated by helping her out. But in Breath of the Wild, you don't remember the heroes until you're ready to free the divine beasts, so you're not motivated by your affection for the character, nor can you really care about their plight since they're long dead. There are living characters like Prince Sidon, who you can connect with, but they practically don't exist outside their area, not to mention they're often one-dimensional. How many fans of Breath of the Wild can name the Rito who helps you board Var Meadow? Not many. I've played hundreds of hours of this game and I can't remember his name. Now, there is an argument to be made that the story is bare bones because it allows for the player to take any path they'd like to defeat Ganon, encouraging open world discovery. I've heard this argument being used to defend the lackluster story, but for me it's a weak foundation to argue from. Why? Because it implies that open world games with a more engaging story or more story beats to complete takes you out of the open world, which simply isn't true, or at least if it does, it's because the player chooses that. Take Skyrim, its main questline has multiple stages, taking you to different locations where you can get lost in side quests and dungeons off the beaten path. In Breath of the Wild, it's defeat Ganon. And yes, because that's all there is to it, the player feels a lot of freedom in how to accomplish that. But that can be said for main quest lines in other open world games too. I was never too engrossed with killing Alduin that I decided, oh, you know what, this main quest has given me another thing to do, therefore I feel inclined to ignore that mysterious cave over there. If anything, I felt bad for spending hours chasing down 10 fireproof lizards for clothing, while Zelda is still sitting in Hyrule Castle waiting for us. Oh well, she's waited 100 years, she can wait a little bit longer. Gotcha, lizard! In each divine beast is some concoction of Ganons that you must defeat. Together, they're visually identical. And yes, in a Zelda game, visuals matter. The bosses matter. They may very well have different attack patterns, but they all have the same defensive weakness. They all upgrade their form at the halfway point. They can all be easily defeated by ancient arrows to the face in a matter of seconds. They are only memorable for all the wrong reasons, because they appear so similar. Thunderblight is the hardest, and all the others are really easy. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. In the ancient cistern of Skyward Sword, the ancient automaton Collectibles is not a difficult boss, but it's far more memorable for its visually stunning battle and unique way to defeat it, and just how badass it feels to smash him with giant swords. None of the Breath of the Wild's bosses are satisfying to fight or defeat. They definitely fit with the lore of the world, so they get points for that. It's just a shame the lore is mediocre and birthed these monstrosities. Once you have defeated the Divine Beast, there's only one more boss to fight, Calamity Ganon. The approach to Hyrule Castle is an epic one. The music, the atmosphere, the sheer amount of guardians at each point, ready to end you. It's a fantastic Zelda dungeon, and demonstrates what Breath of the Wild needs more of. Every time I play through Breath of the Wild, I simply have the best time exploring Hyrule Castle. It has great design, with secret paths and some neat treasures to find. It's also done away with any sort of complex puzzle. This area is all about combat, and there are plenty of fights to be had. Eventually you come to the climax, the showdown with Calamity Ganon. Sadly, this fight is just a 5th Blight battle. This is everything the player has been working towards, and it disappoints. In Skyward Sword, you have an epic showdown with Demise, where the longer the battle goes on, the darker the weather becomes until lightning falls around you, and you use it to deal Demise the final blow. With Calamity Ganon, you do exactly what you did with the Blights until the battle ends. Then, it gets even worse. You are then tasked with defeating Beast Ganon through the power of a cutscene. There's seriously no chance you lose this fight. It's clear it's made to be a movie, some epic scale finish. But as the player, you feel incredibly empty because there's nothing challenging or epic about the fight. And so Breath of the Wild finishes, not with a bang, but with a whimper. To summarize, my final point is this. The Zelda series is made up of some amazing games. Take Ocarina of Time, one of the most beloved and highly rated games of all time. If we were to narrow down why it's such a great game to one single point, it is this. It knows what it wants to be, and it does it flawlessly. Ocarina is not trying to be something that it's not. Breath of the Wild, while being a good game in its own right, is sadly trying to be both an open world game and a Zelda game at the same time, and thus it fails at both. This review scores The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild a 7.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching this thorough review. Please give me some love with a like and a comment below. It's much appreciated. If you'd like more thorough reviews, I have a Pokemon Blue thorough review you might enjoy. Also, you can subscribe for future reviews, such as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and eventually Tears of the Kingdom when it releases. Thanks for watching, and farewell.